The rain in Lyon had a way of falling in silence, as though the city itself was holding its breath. From her small flat in Croix-Rousse, Claire Dubois stood by the window, eyes fixed on the soaked streets below. The street lamps cast long, trembling shadows through the mist. Somewhere in the distance, a tram screeched faintly as it curved around the old stone quarter. Claire had just ended a call. Her knuckles were white from how tightly she gripped the phone, still trembling. It had been Elise, her caseworker contact from the Direction Départementale de la Cohésion Sociale. But it wasn't Elise who answered this time. It was a man. Cold. Measured. Distant. His name was Monsieur Lefebvre, and what he said still rang in her ears like a cracked bell. Madame Dubois, trust the process. She whispered it again, as if hearing it from her own lips would make it more believable. But it didn't. In the next room, 12-year-old Julien was curled beneath a blanket on the sofa, sound asleep. A fading bruise peeked out from beneath his collarbone. He hadn't spoken much since he arrived. Not about what had happened. Not about why he had refused to return to his biological father's home in Villeurbanne. Claire walked over and gently adjusted the blanket around him. Her hands trembled again, this time not from the call, but from the weight of helplessness. She had seen the signs before. The quiet flinches. The eyes that never stayed still. The sharp intake of breath at sudden noise. She had reported it. Not once. Not twice. 4 separate times. And yet, the only official response had been an email acknowledging the concern, followed by silence. Until today. That's when Lefebvre called her, speaking with such pristine detachment that it made her skin crawl. He didn't ask about Julien. He asked about procedures. About documented steps. About compliance. And when Claire interrupted him, begging for something more, anything more, he said it again. Trust the process. She sat on the armrest of the sofa, running a hand through her damp hair, then looked over to the shelf by the door. There, inside a plastic folder, were the notes she'd kept. Dates. Observations. Behavior patterns. Descriptions of bruises. It was detailed, clinical, undeniable. And still, the system wanted her to wait. Claire had worked in child education for 17 years. She believed in structure. She believed in policy. But now, she was beginning to believe something else. That the process they spoke of wasn't built for children like Julien. It was built to keep people like Lefebvre comfortable. Outside, thunder growled low across the city. The streetlights flickered for half a second. Claire stood, walked to the kitchen, and put on the kettle. She needed clarity. She needed calm. And more than anything, she needed to figure out what she was going to do. Because something was coming. She could feel it. Not a storm, but a reckoning. 3 days passed, and the silence from the authorities remained. Claire continued to wait, but each hour gnawed at her nerves like rust on old iron. Julien had grown quieter. His eyes no longer met hers. He jumped at the smallest sound and clutched his school bag to his chest at night, as if it were armor. One evening, as Claire returned from the grocer's, she saw a familiar figure standing at the bottom of her stairs. A tall man in a gray coat, damp from the drizzle. It was Julien's father, Mathis Fallon. Her breath caught. Bonsoir, Madame Dubois, he said with a half-smile, though his eyes held no warmth. I was told Julien is here. Claire stood frozen, a bag of apples slipping slightly from her arm. I wasn't informed of any visitation, she replied, her voice cold but steady. He took a slow step forward. I'm not here to visit. I'm here to bring my son home. That was a lie. Claire knew it. His court-ordered visits were suspended pending the investigation. But how did he even know Julien was staying with her? She didn't answer. She turned, entered the building, and locked the door behind her. From the window upstairs, she watched him light a cigarette and linger outside for 15 minutes before finally disappearing into the Lyon night. When she called the department the next day, she was told, yet again, that the case is under review. Julien hadn't seen his father that night, but he sensed something had changed. Later that evening, as she tucked him in, Julien spoke for the first time in days. I don't want to go back. Claire sat beside him, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the room. "You won't," she whispered. "I promise." But in the quiet that followed, she questioned whether a promise still meant anything in a world run by processes. The next morning, Claire visited the prefecture in person. The reception was sterile, the waiting room filled with the hushed murmurs of other desperate voices. When her name was finally called, she was led into a room by a junior officer who wore a tie far too tight. She laid everything out: the documentation, the photos, Julian's psychological report from school, the bruises, the silence, the fear. The officer nodded politely, took notes, and said, "We will add this to the file." Claire leaned forward. "What is the file going to do?" "Julian doesn't sleep. He flinches at shadows. And his father stood outside my flat." The man raised a hand. "Madam, please. We understand your concern, but you must let the process run its course." That phrase again. It was as if the system had been built not to prevent harm, but to document its aftermath. Claire returned home, eyes burning. Julian sat on the sofa with his sketchpad, drawing tiny figures in vast, empty rooms. The file was growing thicker, but so was the silence. Claire was awakened just past midnight by the ringing of her phone. She answered instinctively. A voice, young and trembling, whispered down the line. "Is this Claire Dubois?"
"Yes."
"Who is this?" "It's Lena. I used to live with Mathis Fallon. Before Julian." Claire sat upright, heart thudding. "I saw your number on a report. I wasn't supposed to." Lena's voice shook. "He's dangerous. He's smart. He knows how to look clean when people are watching." But behind closed doors, silence crackled between them. "Please," Lena said, "don't let him take Julian back." Before Claire could speak again, the line went dead. The next morning, Claire scoured old case files. She found Lena's name buried in a redacted section. She had aged out of the system.
Gone.
Forgotten. But her warning lingered. And now, Claire wasn't just Julian's guardian. She was his shield. A week later, a courier arrived with a sealed envelope from the tribunal. Claire opened it with shaking hands. It was a court date. An emergency hearing had been requested by Mathis Fallon. He was seeking to regain full custody, arguing that Claire had influenced the boy and refused access unlawfully. Attached was a copy of a psychologist's report, a private one, commissioned and paid for by Mathis. It described Julian as emotionally unstable and prone to fabrication. Claire's jaw clenched. It was full of half-truths twisted into legal weapons. She called Elise, but her line went straight to voicemail. Then came another knock. This time, 2 officials arrived for a wellness check.
Claire complied. "Let them in."
Showed them Julian's room, his drawings, his schedule. They nodded, took notes, but didn't look at the child. Not really. As they left, one of them glanced back and said it again. "Just trust the process." Claire stared after them, a hollow fire burning in her chest. She no longer trusted the process. She trusted herself. The courtroom was cold and gray, with echoes that made even the smallest sounds feel sharp. Julian sat beside Claire, his small hand wrapped around hers. Across the room, Mathis sat with his lawyer, smug and straight-backed. The judge, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, began the proceedings. Mathis spoke first, playing the role of a concerned father. He mentioned Claire's lack of legal training, claimed she was obstructing visitation, painted Julian's fear as confusion from a broken home. Claire waited. Then she stood and told the truth. She spoke of Julian's night terrors, the bruises, the phone call from Lena. She presented files, photos, drawings. And then she handed over one final thing. A voice recording. Julian's voice. Speaking in the dead of night. Confessing things no child should have to say. The courtroom fell silent, and the judge adjourned. But no verdict was given. Just another date. More waiting. More process. Claire knew the system would not protect Julian. Not in time. Not fully. So she began her own quiet rebellion. She contacted Lena again, this time through an encrypted message board for former foster youth. It took days before Lena replied, but when she did, it came with a voice note. Her story, her scars, names,
Dates.
even a location. Claire transcribed every word. She compiled a dossier and quietly handed it to an old colleague, now working at a regional investigative newspaper. Not under her name. Not as a whistleblower. Just anonymously. Meanwhile, Julian began to draw again. But this time, the scenes were different. A house. A garden. A woman with glasses holding a lantern in the dark. "You drew me," Claire said. Julian shook his head. "No," he replied. "I drew the person I want you to be." And just like that, Claire realized the truth.
She already was.
It began as a whisper. A small blog post by an independent journalist. Then it was shared, reposted, picked up by a Lion radio segment. Multiple allegations of systemic neglect in child welfare. The post named no one. But the patterns were familiar. The language too close. The details chillingly precise. Within a week, 2 local deputies requested a formal review of several active cases, including one involving Mathis Fallon. Claire received a call, this time not from Lefebvre, but from someone new. A woman from the Inspection Générale des Affaires Sociales. Polite, cautious, but asking real questions. It wasn't justice, but it was movement. That evening, Julian placed a single drawing on the table. A faceless man surrounded by cages made of paper. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. On the day of the final hearing, Lion was gray, with thick clouds. Claire and Julian arrived at the courthouse just after dawn. Mathis didn't show. Instead, his lawyer requested an adjournment, but the judge denied it. Then came a moment no one expected.
Julian asked to speak.
The room went still. He stood, barely reaching the height of the wooden railing, and told his truth.
Clearly.
Softly. About fear. About fists. About silence. And about a woman who never stopped believing him. Claire watched as the judge listened, not with procedure, but with human eyes. And for the first time, the phrase best interest of the child felt like more than a formality. Outside, as they stepped into the damp courtyard, rain began to fall. But Julian laughed, because this time, the storm meant something had passed, not something coming. Weeks later, Claire received the final ruling.
Full guardianship. Permanent.
Irrevocable. Julian's name would remain his, but his home had changed. The tribunal acknowledged failures. Apologies were sent. Promises were made. But Claire knew the system would forget again. So she didn't celebrate. Instead, she enrolled Julian in a small school in the Montchat district. Quiet.
Warm.
Nothing extraordinary. And one night, while sorting through her papers, Claire found the original envelope, the one that had summoned her to court. She placed it in a box marked Begin Again and locked it in a drawer. As Julian slept upstairs, rain kissed the windows once more. Claire stood in the hallway, hand on the door. Not waiting for it to open. Just grateful it had finally closed.